The last approach that you need to know for your AS course is the biological approach, and this suggests that it's our physiology, our internal processes which are responsible for our behaviour. So there are three different areas that you need to know about in the biological approach. The first one is biochemistry, so that's the chemicals within our body and how they can affect behaviour. The second one is our genetics, and that links to evolution. And the third one is the central nervous system, which is made up of the brain and spinal cord. So biochemistry first then. Biochemistry is split into two different sections. There's hormones and there's neurotransmitters. Now, hormones are produced from glands, and these glands, you have glands all around your body. They are largely controlled by the master gland, which is the pituitary gland at the base of the brain. And hormones travel in the bloodstream, and they act on organs or muscles everywhere in your body. So these organs will have receptor sites, and when the hormone binds to them, they will change our behaviour in some way. So to give you an example, testosterone, the male sex hormone, is associated with increased aggression. So people with higher levels of testosterone can be more aggressive in their behaviour. Neurotransmitters don't work all over the body. So neurotransmitters only act within the central nervous system or within the brain, and they are released between neurons, and they help to carry messages. So neurons are the body's way of sending messages about what's happening in the outside world, taking it to the brain so that information can be processed, and neurotransmitters are part of that. So they will carry messages to and from the brain. Serotonin is one example of a neurotransmitter. It's implicated in lots of different behaviours, one of them being depression, where low levels of serotonin are associated with depression. The second area you need to know about is genetics, and this simply says that we can inherit behaviour from our parents. So remember, we get 50% of our genes from each of our parents. So it could be argued, if a gene is responsible for a particular behaviour and our parent has that behaviour, we have a 50% chance of showing that behaviour as well. Now, there are two key terms here which we're going to come back to when we look at biopsychology, but I will introduce them here, and that's genotype and phenotype. Now, a genotype is the specific genes that you have, but just because you have a particular gene doesn't mean that gene will be expressed. So the phenotype is the expression, the physical expression of a particular gene, and that is also influenced by the environment. Now, that's something which is known as the diathesis stress model, and as I said, we will return to that later in the course. So if we're thinking about examples of genes which can be influenced, behaviours which can be influenced by genes, OCD is one, which we will come back to and look at in more detail. We've got the SERT gene and the COMT gene. Both of them have been implicated in OCD. Now, the link to evolution. So genes are passed down not just sort of in one or two generations, they're passed down for many, many generations. So the genes that we carry now have been passed down from thousands of years ago, and they have been selected as being the genes which are best for our survival. So this is the process of natural selection, and means that genes and behaviours which help us to survive are passed on, and those genes and behaviours which are not helpful to our survival are not passed on, because generally those individuals who carried them would not have survived in order to reproduce. So we could argue that if a behaviour is genetic, it's also adaptive, and adaptive means it is something which enabled us to survive thousands of years ago. The last section you need to know about is the central nervous system, which, as you can see in this diagram, is composed of the brain and the spinal cord. Now, the brain and the spinal cord are central to all of our behaviours and all of our bodily processes, even the ones that we don't do consciously, like breathing and keeping our heart beating. So any changes to the brain or the spinal cord necessarily will impact behaviour as well. So to give you an example, damage to the prefrontal cortex, which is an area of the brain which is at the very front, has been associated with changes to personality and increased levels of aggression. And we think that's because the prefrontal cortex is, or part of the job of the prefrontal cortex is to control impulses. So without that level of control, personality changes and aggression increases. So things that you need to know before you come into the lesson. Make sure that you can explain how biological psychologists explain behaviour. So using key terms, can you give a summary of that? Secondly, explain how biochemistry can influence behaviour. Thirdly, explain how genetics and evolution can influence behaviour, and that link between genetics and evolution is very important. And lastly, can you explain how the central nervous system can affect behaviour? As always, you can go back, look through this video as many times as you like, or read the pre-reading, and there will be more information. All of these concepts will be covered in more depth in there.